Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex and this week's episode is going to be a Dominaria Remastered Draft Primer episode. So first and foremost, what is Dominaria Remastered? Because I know not a lot of people aren't going to know what this set is. This is a supplemental set, so think along the lines of Modern Horizons, Modern Masters, those kind of sets. But it's made up of all reprints from sets where Dominaria was the plane. So I know a lot of people, when they first heard Dominaria Remastered, they thought, oh, like 2018 Dominaria, maybe throw in a few cards here and there. It's actually just an entirely new draft format, and it's all reprinted cards. There's no new cards here, but the cards you'll see span all of Magic's history, basically. So think Time Spiral block, think Urza Saga block, a lot of cards from the 90s, a lot of these old cards that actually look kind of funky by today's standards. We'll get into that a little bit later. So if you're familiar with those old cards, it's going to be a very nostalgic trip. If you're not, well, come along for the ride. We'll talk about what's good in the set if you do plan to draft it this weekend. It is not a set that is on Arena, but I mentioned this weekend because pre-release is this weekend for some stores, and there's the full release coming the week after. So this is going to be available at your local game store. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be looking to draft it. So hoping just to fill you in on my observations. I've done a deep dive of the set. We're going to go through some archetypes. We're going to go through some top cards. I think that is the most important thing when you're dealing with a set with a bunch of new cards. Just touch on the big picture stuff, especially when there's a lot of cards in the set that might not look like the good cards of a 2023 Magic set. A lot of the principles when you think of what makes a good draft card have kind of definitely changed in the past 20 years. So we're going to try to navigate a little bit of that today as we get into our discussion. Just before we jump in though, of course, want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. If you like the show, if you like what's going on here, if you feel like you've learned something, go check that out. It's the best way to support the show, best way to support any of my content. Of course, there's going to be a bunch of reward tiers over there that you can check out. We want to give back to you if you choose to give to us. And as always, super appreciate everybody who supports each and every week. So thank you so much. All right, so let's just jump in. The first thing I want to cover here is just to kind of set some expectations and maybe calibrate you to what the cards in this set look like when you're trying to evaluate cards. So one of the reasons that I wanted to do this episode is when I saw some conversation on Twitter or in my Discord about this set. Maybe people did some draft sims just to get a feel for the set, what it looked like and what it felt like. There was a lot of discussion that just basically went along the lines of, okay, I looked at the set, I did some drafts, and the cards all look terrible to me. And I think that's true for a lot of the cards where, if you compare them to modern cards, they are going to look pretty bad. And I think the thing you have to keep in mind is especially the creatures in this set are not going to hold up to what you would expect to see in a modern limited set. So a very clear example is we have a card Avon Fisher here, which is a solid card. Not an amazing card, but a solid one. So this is a common 3 and a blue for a 2/2 flyer, and when it dies, you can draw a card. Okay, so not too bad, of course, but if you look at Talus Lookout, which is from Dominaria United, we just had this card, 2 blue for a 3/2 flyer. When it dies, you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, one to the graveyard. Well, then you look at Avon Fisher and you're like, wow, that card's much worse. And it is, but that's kind of what you got to expect for the creatures in this set. Something like Ridgetop Raptor, which is 3 and a red for a 2/1 double strike. At common, not a great card, but it is a playable card by the standards of the creatures in the set. Now, I'm not going to put a bunch of Ridgetop Raptors in my deck, but it's also not an unplayable card by any means, I would say. I think when you're evaluating cards in this set, especially creatures, you kind of have to ignore our modern vanilla test when you're looking at cards, because most of the good creatures in this set are not good because of their stats. It's not like, oh wow, you're getting a 4-mana 5/5, that's so good, it's a good card. I mean, those exist in small numbers, but most of the time, the good creatures in this set are utility creatures. They give you some sort of effect, or they have a tap ability, or they make mana. So for example, we've got Mana War, which is, such a classic. 2 and a blue for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, return target creature to its owner's hand. It's just one of the best commons in the set. Ubiquitously good, very good creature, but this is the kind of card you're looking for as your creature base, right? Something like Nomad Decoy is another good example. 2 and a white for a 1/2. It's got white, tap target creature, so it's a tapper, which is, just a utility creature, generally the kind of valuable creatures you'd see in these older sets. It's also got this other ability, white, tap it, tap 2 creatures, Activate this ability only if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, so it's got a little bit of a threshold going on there, which for older players, you'll know that. For newer players, I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Werebear is another one here, 1 and a green for a 1/1, taps to add green, and it's also got threshold, so if you've got 7 or more cards in your graveyard, Werebear gets +3/+3. Most of the time, when you're looking at, should I put this card in my deck, it's for an enter the battlefield ability, or for some sort of utility. Again, there are going to be like just good flyers. Flyers are quite good in this set because games are going to be a little bit slower. People aren't going to be bashing you in with 2 mana, 3 power creatures very often. So just, classic limited principles apply where if the ground gets gummed up, which it's going to often in a slower set like this one, flyers get a little bit better. So something like the Aven Skyfisher, like I was just talking about, bump that up a little bit more even in your mind. Because it's like, okay, well, maybe 4 mana for 2 power flying isn't actually that bad. And of course, this isn't just a low power set. There is a lot of power in it, but as any player that has played, in previous years or played in 1999 or whatever knows, the power comes from the spells, not necessarily the creatures. Creatures were really quite underpowered, at least by our standards, for a pretty long time in Magic. The spells, the instant sorceries, that's where your money was. So in this set, at common, we've got Counterspell, the OG, blue, counter target spell. Chain Lightning, single red mana, sorcery at common, deals 3 damage to any target, and then it's got this weird thing where any other player can pay red to copy it, and then you can keep chaining it. So if you have the red, you can copy it again. But mostly it's just a 1 mana deal 3, which is very good. You wouldn't see that generally in most standard legal sets, especially one that can go to face. Terror, another classic, 1 and a black for an instant at common, destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature, it can't be regenerated. So again, if you look through the card file, it definitely looks a bit underpowered because often our eyes are drawn to the creatures. We're looking in Modern Limited at, well, what's the best 2-drop I can pick up here, or what's the best 3-drop, and often the games are dictated by creatures. Shift that a little bit, right? The powerful spells are going to be quite good. And I'm not saying you want to have a 9-creature deck very often, right? You're still going to have a curve of creatures. It's just that you're not looking for, the bangers in your deck are not often going to be your creatures. It's more often than not going to be these powerful, cheap spells. Another quality of the set that you'll notice if you do a little bit of digging, and it's very much akin to the Magic sets of yore, is that the 2-color pairs, the archetypes, are pretty loosely defined. Now, they've done a good job of, I think, retroactively inserting archetypes into, making archetypes out of these old cards. But even still, it's a lot looser than you're going to see in a Modern Limited set. And, to their credit, I think they did a good job. But even still, there are a few archetypes that are just like, well, here's some good cards. For example here, we've got Gerard's Verdict. And this is the black, white, gold uncommon. And there is signpost quote-unquote uncommons, gold uncommons for each color pair. But as you'll see with Gerard's Verdict here, which is a sorcery at uncommon, target player discards 2 cards, you gain 3 life for each land discarded this way. What does that point you to? Like, it doesn't really point you to any deck in particular. On paper, they've said black-white is like a drain and gain, my black creatures hurt me and my white cards gain me life kind of deck. But that's like extremely loose. It's kind of like one of those archetypes where like, well, we gotta call it something, right? Now, Gerard's Verdict is a good card. Just 2 mana, you discard 2 cards, I might gain some life. It's a powerful card, certainly. But don't look to all of these gold cards, and don't look through all the archetypes as, oh, well, I'm specifically doing this thing. I'm gonna get to some archetypes as we go on. But even then, blue-red, for example, is a storm deck. And you could be doing the storm thing, but I also just think you could have like some good red removal and some good blue fires, right? Older Limited, and you'll hear this a lot from folks who played Older Limited, it's a lot less on rails, and a lot of those folks kind of feel like today's Limited is very on rails, where it's like, okay, I'm blue-black, I guess I'm gonna draft ninjas, it's kind of that kind of feeling. This is very much more, individual card quality matters, and picking up powerful cards matters, and kind of 2-card interactions. Also, just thinking about what your deck is doing broadly, right? I could easily have a red-blue tempo deck and a red-blue control deck in this format. I think both are pretty viable, right? It's much more about what the cards you have are telling you to do. Maybe even some rares you picked up early, what those incentivize you to do, either be aggressive or, be more controlling. Less so about, well, you definitely need to be doing this thing if you're in this color pair. Okay, so before we lead into some of those archetypes, I just want to cover some cycles that are in this set just to get you a little more acquainted with some of the cards. So one of the cycles here is a set of uncommon split cards. And the way that these split cards are, these are the original ones. So Fire, Ice, Life, Death, Wax, Wane, for folks who might know those cards. But these are kind of supplementary to the gold 2-color uncommons, where each color pair gets one of these. And they're generally pretty good. Some are better than others. So there's one or two that are like pretty bad. And if you're evaluating these, they're actually fairly easy to evaluate. I think the good ones look good and the bad ones look bad. So one of the better ones, potentially the best one, is Fire Ice. This is a all-time classic. He's played still in older formats. So this is Fire is one side. It's 1 or red, instant. Fire deals 2 damage divided as you choose among 1 or 2 targets. And then Ice, 1 and a blue, instant. Tap target permanent, you draw a card. So, just a solid card. Another pretty good one, Life and Death. Life is a single green mana sorcery. All your lands you control become 1/1 creatures until end of turn. So, just, turn all your lands into a little army. And Death, 1 and a black sorcery. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You lose life equal to its mana value. It's reanimate at 1 more mana. Worth noting, too, that there are big cycling creatures in this set, like 6 mana, 4/5s and stuff. So you can have the thing where you go, all right, on turn 2, I cycle my giant creature, I death it back, and now I've got a really big creature, and I only paid 2 mana for it. So, there's some stuff like that going on with this card. Generally, there isn't, all these cards don't point towards a specific archetype, just like the 2-color uncommons don't really as well. But they are just, power to the people that if you're drafting blue-red, great, you get Fire Ice. Most of these cards, I wouldn't just put in my deck as fire. I mean, fire is actually kind of an exception. That card is just fine. But most of the time, I would say that these cards are going to make it to the people at the table in the draft that are drafting these color pairs more often than not. Next up, we've got a cycle of cycling lands. So these are at common. They enter the battlefield tapped. There's 1 in each color. Smoldering Crater, Polluted Mire, that's the red and black ones. They add a color of whatever color they are, and then they have cycling for 2 mana. So discard this card, draw this card, or draw a card for 2 mana. And these are generally good cards to have in your deck. Like, a deck with 3 cycling lands versus a deck without any cycling lands, you're going to have a pretty meaningful advantage versus the person that doesn't have the cycling lands, because you're just going to flood so much less often. And also, the more you have of these, the more lands you should play, because, you don't mind drawing an additional land in the late game. You can cycle it away. So when you have 3 of these, I would generally play 18 lands. In the draft, don't take them too early. They're not first, second, third picks. But once you know your colors, you should prioritize these. It's almost like prioritizing lands in Vintage Cube. It's once you know your colors, take them quite highly. Because, again, you don't want to be the person that doesn't have any of these in your deck. You're flooding, and your opponents just won't flood as often. Also, there is a cycling sub-theme. There's a cycling archetype. So these play a part in that as well. And I did mention Threshold is a mechanic in this set, which pays you off for having 7 or more cards in your graveyard. This is a pretty decent way to get a card in your graveyard. The last cycle I want to talk about here is the Layer cycle. And this really highlights the old school nature of this set. So these are uncommon lands, and they add 1 of 3 colors. So they're 3-color lands, and they come in untapped. And you're like, okay, well, what's the catch here? It's a pretty meaningful catch. So Trevor Ruins is the one I have here in front of me. Adds green, white, or blue. It says, when it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless you return a non-layer land you control to its owner's hand. So it's fixing you for 3 colors, but at the cost of your land drop per turn, essentially. You don't go up a land, you have to return it. Now, it's not like it's card disadvantage or anything, but it will cost you some tempo. There is very, very minimal fixing in this set. There is this cycle. There is a land that's sort of like an Evolving Wilds, and I think there might be 1 green card that fixes you. So if you are splashing, this is kind of the best option you have. And again, this is very, very reminiscent of older draft formats like Invasion, where this was considered pretty decent fixing. Now, one thing I do want to highlight as well is just like in those older sets where it was a little bit slower, this set is going to be a little bit slower than what you're used to. So that tempo loss of picking up a land won't hurt you incredibly. You don't need to be jamming your entire deck with 4 of these or anything. But if you do have a really powerful card to splash, it's probably worth playing one of these Ruins or picking up one in the draft so that your mana is just a little bit better. So with all of that big picture stuff out of the way, let's move into archetypes. So there are 10 2-color archetypes and also a hidden kind of 11th archetype that I'll touch on. And once again, these are not definitive. You've got to do this if you're green-white. You've got to do this if you're blue-red. But they are, I did figure it is a good idea to talk about the on paper what Wizards has said these archetypes are. And some of them, you're going to lean into them more than others, and we'll touch on that. So the first deck up here is green-white Threshold. So once again, Threshold is a mechanic that says as long as you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, your card gets a bonus. And the gold Signpost Uncommon here is actually a banger. This card's actually pretty good. So this is Mystic Enforcer, 2 green-white for a 3/3. It's got protection from black, and when you get Threshold, the Enforcer gets +3/+3 and has flying. And, you know, as we get into this, just like I talked about Gerard's Verdict, some of these gold uncommons are going to be more indicative of what their color pair is trying to do, and some of them are just like, well, here's a good card that will toss your way. But this one is definitely speaking to the green-white Threshold theme. And Threshold as a deck, you know, often we think of green-white as like a aggro deck in a lot of limited formats. Threshold leans itself a little bit more to the late game, a little more mid-rangey. You're going to be playing stuff on curve, just normal, and the idea is kind of scaling threats as the game goes on, right? So Werebear, which is one of the cards I mentioned before, is the 1 in a green 1/1 that taps to add a green. Then it gets +3/+3 if you have Threshold. You play it on turn 2, you ramp some stuff out, and then it becomes an actual threat later. A 4/4 is pretty big, especially when compared to the other creatures in this format. Nomad Decoy, that's the tapper I mentioned. Mystic Zealot is another pretty decent one to comment here. 3 and a white for a 2/4. Threshold, it gets +1/+1 and it has flying. So don't think of this deck as a all-in aggro deck. It's more like green-white mid-range that gets better in the late game. Now, of course, you can turbo out getting to Threshold, and in these decks, you do want to prioritize the cycling lands. That's a really good way to get cards in your graveyard. But even just stuff like Nature's Lore, which is like a 2-mana green ramp spell. It goes, gets a forest, puts on the battlefield. Proactive instants and sorceries that go to your graveyard. Something like Mindstone, which is a 2-mana artifact that taps to add a colorless. 1, tap it, sacrifice it, you draw a card. That's another thing that, you know, play it early, power something out, sack it, get a card in your grave. You can power up your Threshold cards. Millikin is a pretty decent one if you've got some good top end. 2-mana 0/1 taps to add a colorless mana and you mill a card. So just this can really, really fuel you out. You know, there are some light graveyard synergies in the set where there's some overlap with maybe some of the black cards. Again, I don't think it's that likely you're going to be splashing very often, but, you know, there are some situations where I can see you have kind of like more of an Obzon graveyard deck. So, yeah, the big thing here is just don't think of it too much as an aggro deck. And if you look at the white cards in this set, they're actually pretty geared towards a slower game plan. There's not a lot of cheap, aggressive white creatures. I mean, there's a few in there, but for the most part, they are geared more towards this kind of game plan, the slower, some flyers at the top end, and that's mostly what you want to focus on. Next up, we've got green-red cycling, and I put green with a question mark in quotations because the green is, I think it is dubious how much it actually adds to this archetype. So the quote-unquote Signpost Uncommon here is Radha, Heir of Keld. It's a red-green 2/2 that is legendary, and when it attacks, you add red-red, and you can also tap it to add a green. So it's like a 2-mana 2/2 mana elf that when it attacks, you get 2 red mana that goes away after your attack step. So you have to have some sort of instant or an instant speed way to use the mana and activate an ability or something, but it's a fine card. It doesn't really speak to the theme here of green-red cycling, and the real uncommon here, the Signpost Uncommon, is Lightning Rift. So this is a 1 in a red enchantment. Whenever a player cycles a card, and that's you or your opponent, you can pay 1. If you do, Lightning Rift deals 2 damage to any target. And this card it's a banger. This saw constructed play at the time. Any limited format that this card's been in, it's been, you know, supported and quite good. Think of just how many of your cards can have cycling in your deck when there are cycling lands in the format, right? If you pick up cycling lands pretty highly, that's like 5 cards if you're, you know, prioritizing lands highly, and then maybe another 6 or 7 of your cards in your deck have cycling, and you just get to play cantripping shocks, basically, right? And that's really powerful, especially in a format where sometimes your 4 and 5 mana creatures have 2 toughness. And noteworthy here, this does go to the face too, so you can actually just kill your opponent with this Lightning Rift. If you have 2, the game just ends so quickly. Your opponent really can't do too much. So this is a really good build around. It's worth building towards. There's a green counterpart, Invigorating Boon, which is nowhere near as good as Lightning Rift, but it's a playable card. So this is 1 in a green for an enchantment, also an uncommon. Whenever a player cycles a card, it's the same text, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So not as flashy for sure, but again, it is a solid card. You could play this card, but Lightning Rift is the star of the show here. Alright, so Lightning Rift and Invigorating Boon, those are your payoffs, but what are your actual good cycling cards you're putting in your deck? So like I mentioned, there are the cycling lands, but there are a few other pretty good cards. Elvish Aberration is a solid one. 5 and a green for a 4/5 that taps to add green, green, green. So it's a 6-drop that ramps you further, but it also has forest cycling for 2 mana. So 2 mana, you can go get a forest. And this is like the kind of card that looks a little bit underwhelming if you're used to, thinking about this in a modern sense, comparing it to modern cards, but that's beefy. 6 mana 4/5 is reasonably large. There are a few mana sinks, and there's a lot of card draw in this format, so that's, don't discount that add green, green, green ability. It does come up. Solar Blast is another pretty good one. This is 3 in a red for an instant at common. It deals 3 damage to any target. It has cycling for 1 red, and then whenever you cycle Solar Blast, you can have it deal damage to any target. So it's almost like a split card of 4 mana, deal 3 to anything, or 3 mana, deal 1 to something, draw a card, which, pretty solid card in general. There are a lot of cards in the set that are kind of sprinkled throughout the file that are situational cycling cards where, it's a card that might not be very good in general, but, you can cycle it away if you don't want it. So there's like a 4 mana naturalize effect. That kind of card is going to be, more of a filler card. There's also a few non-green or red options. So, like I mentioned, Lightning Rift is the star of the show. So I don't think you need to actually be green-red specifically for this deck to work. In fact, I think it's like you're not tied on to green at all. There are 2 black cards here that really stick out to me. 1, Constructed All-Star Street Wraith. So this is 3 black for a common 3/4 Swamp Walk. So not the best body, but against somebody with swamps, it's actually pretty good. And then it has cycling, no mana, but pay 2 life. So it's free cycling. Also, Ichor Slick, which is one of the better removal spells in the format. 2 and a black for a sorcery at common. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. And this card is a design masterpiece, by the way. It's one of the all-timers. If you're all into Magic design and you read this card, you're like, wow, that's a really sweet one. So the other 2 abilities this card has, so, baseline 3 mana, 2 and a black, -3/-3, but it also has cycling and madness. So cycling costs 2, madness costs 3 and a black. For those who don't know madness, basically what that says is if this card would be discarded, you can instead pay the madness cost and you get to play this card. So if you think about it, what happens is you pay 2 to cycle it, it gets discarded, you madness it, so you've got a 6 mana -3/-3, you draw a card, and the beauty here is cycling it at instant speed means you can madness it at instant speed, which actually turns this into an instant speed removal spell. So really cool card. Tying these all back to cycling, if you just have a bunch of like Lightning Rifts and Ichor Slicks, like that sounds like a great deck to me. So yeah, I don't think you're at all confined to green with this deck. And as long as you have a Lightning Rift, you can really go wild. And the more cycling payoffs you have, the more kind of medium enablers you'll want to play. Think back to Ikoria, where if you had the Sicko cycling deck with a bunch of Flourishing Foxes, maybe you had a Zenith Flare, you're just playing cards in your deck that literally, you didn't care about their card text. It could be a blue card in your red-white deck, and you just cared about that it had cycling for 1 mana. Kind of a similar thing here. There is colorless cycling, so, if you have 3 Lightning Rifts, you could put a cycling card in your deck, even if it literally cannot be cast. So just something to consider. All right, moving on to a really fun one, and probably one of the more synergistic decks, Blue-Red Storm. So the signpost uncommon, quote-unquote here, is Quicksilver Dagger. It's an aura. 1 blue-red. Enchanted creature has tap. This creature deals 1 damage to target player or a planeswalker, and you draw a card. Does not speak to Storm whatsoever. It does speak to a different archetype, the hidden archetype that I'm going to get to in a second here. But this is an okay card. To put it on something, that thing turns into a draw engine that pings your opponent. It's quite a good card, in fact. It just doesn't speak to what this deck is doing on paper anyways. So Blue-Red Storm's main thing here that you're doing, the main Storm card you care about in this format is Empty the Warrens. So this is 3 and a red for a sorcery. Create 2 1/1 goblin creature tokens with Storm. So 4 mana, you make 2 1/1s and it scales from there. I'll also say, for those who don't know what Storm is a mechanic that says when you cast this spell, copy it for each spell casted before it this turn. So basically the idea is you want to somehow make a lot of mana, either through like rituals or just hitting your land drops or mana rocks, and card draw to find your combo pieces, and you'll have this one big turn where you make some mana, you cast some cards that maybe are free on mana. There's cards in this format that untap your lands when you cast them, and then you empty the Warrens for like 6 or 7 that makes, just a bunch of goblins, and you attack your opponent and kill them over the course of 2 turns. That's the main plan here. We'll get into some specifics in a second. There's also 2 supplementary Storm cards that I think are lesser, but you can still definitely play them. They're not going to be your main thing. Storm Entity, which is 1 and a red for a 1/1. It's got haste, and it says it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each spell cast this turn. So, the idea is you storm off a bunch, and maybe this is a 2-mana 5/5, which is not that impressive. Like, this is why I think it's a secondary payoff, where your opponent's just like, okay, cool, I'll chump that, and then I'll kill it. It's just not that big of a deal. Grape Shot, which is, I think, more of a removal spell than a kill condition, although, it can be a hybrid thing going on here where you kind of peck into your opponent. But Grape Shot is 1 and a red for a sorcery. Grape Shot deals 1 damage to any target. So in Constructed, you can really, really go off and storm off for 20 and then kill them with this. Much less likely to happen in Limited. You just don't have the density of good cards to be able to kill your opponent with a Grape Shot. So Empty the Warrens is your main kill condition. Storm Entity and Grape Shot kind of as secondary ones. Of course, the question is, well, how are you casting 6 or 7 spells in one turn? Well, the answer is there is a bunch of spells, like I mentioned, that either add mana after you cast them, or they untap lands to make them essentially free. So we've got something like Cloud of Fairies here, which is 1 and a blue for a 1/1 flyer at common. When it enters the battlefield, you untap up to 2 lands. So it's a free 1/1 flyer, quote unquote free on mana. It also has cycling too, for what it's worth. Peregrine Drake, very similar card, 5 mana, 4 and a blue. For a 2/3 flyer, when it enters the battlefield, you untap up to 5 lands. Coal Stoker is a creature, it's a 3 and a red 3/3 at common. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it from your hand, add red. So it essentially costs 1 mana to add to your storm count, and you get a 3/3. All of these cards are exactly what you want in this deck. Exactly the kind of cards. So when you have drawn a bunch of cards, and you've got 2 Cloud of Fairies and a Peregrine Drake, you go Cloud of Fairies, untap. Play another Cloud of Fairies, untap. Peregrine Drake, untap. Worth noting, actually, Peregrine Drake is actually just a fine card. Just 5 mana, 2/3 flyer that is free on mana is pretty solid. You just play that in your non-storm decks in this format too. Obviously, it shines here. A card I want to call out as pretty important, and I would play basically as many copies as I could get for this deck, is Frantic Search. So this is 3 and a blue for an instant. Draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards. Untap up to 3 lands. So it's not a card advantage spell. You're really just digging. And in fact, you go down a card because you have to spend this to draw 2, discard 2. But again, it is free, quote unquote. You untap 3 lands and you dig to your combo pieces. It's just a really important card to be able to, 1, add to your storm count, but 2, finding these specific pieces so you have that one big storm turn. That is the most important part of what this card's doing. And if you have a storm deck that doesn't have any velocity, no way to see extra cards, just like any combo deck, right? It's going to fail if you can't find your right pieces. So this is a pretty important part of the deck, I would say. Also, you can really combo off, go really big if you have High Tide and you have a High Tide deck. So High Tide is a single blue instant at uncommon. It says, until end of turn, whenever a player taps an island for mana, that player adds blue in addition to whatever you tap for. So essentially it makes your islands tap for 2. And what you can do with this is cast your Frantic Searches or your Peregrine Drakes, and you actually net mana off of them, right? You're generating mana each time you cast one of these untappers. So that's kind of the core of the deck. Just, untapping your lands, casting multiple spells. You've also got this kind of weird crossover with Skirk Prospector, which is a single red mana 1/1 that you can sacrifice a goblin to add red mana. So it's on its own, it's a storm count for free, right? You can play it and you can sacrifice it for a red mana. But there's weird crossover because Empty the Warrens also makes goblins. So if you have this in play, you can actually keep storming off or sink mana into something, a big X spell. If that's part of your combo. There's also some, just a lot of goblins in the set. So you could have some sort of Skirk Prospector setup where that's how you're making a bunch of mana. I think it's a little bit more niche, not going to be the default, but just wanted to call it out as I think something that you could do, something with a little bit of overlap with the other cards in the set. And I do want to shout out that aside from the storm cards and the mana producers, like the untappers, another big part of storm decks, and this is something that, was never explicitly told to me, I think, when I first heard about a storm deck. I'm like, well, how are you casting all these cards and how are you finding all the cards? You need to be able to have mana accelerants and card draw. That's pretty important. More card draw than the accelerants, like a Mind Stone, which is the 2 mana rock that adds a colorless mana. That's a solid card. You can just add, put in your deck so you have additional mana source as you're comboing off. A little bit less important as the card draw. Something like Deep Analysis, which is 3 and a blue for a sorcery. Target player draws 2 cards and it flashes back for 1 and a blue, pay 3 life. Just, you need to find those combo pieces. I can't stress that enough. The more cards you can see, the better. Impulse is also in this set. 1 in a blue. Look at the top 4 cards of your library. You pick a card. You gotta have that card selection or your deck's just not gonna function. And then I did want to touch on the hidden archetype that's in this format. Crabs, specifically Horseshoe Crab. So this is a combo that was actually in a previous Masters set. I think Masters 25. Horseshoe Crab is a creature. It's 2 in a blue for a 1/3. Has the ability blue, untap Horseshoe Crab. So I mentioned Quicksilver Dagger before, but I'll read it again. This is the 1 blue-red aura that you put in a creature. It has tap, you draw a card and deal a damage to target creature or planeswalker. Also, a similar card, Hermetic Study, 1 in a blue for a common, enchant creature. Enchant creature has this creature deals tap, this creature deals 1 damage to any target. So, of course, the idea here is you combo the Horseshoe Crab with one of these enchantments and you kind of machine gun down your opponent's things or draw a bunch of cards and deal a bunch of damage to your opponent each turn. Is this a good thing to do? It's solid. Honestly, like, I think if you had the Storm infrastructure and didn't end up, with the perfect Storm deck, this is a decent thing to fall back on when you're already set up to, like, make a bunch of mana and draw a bunch of cards to find these combo pieces. Especially if you're playing in, like, a best-of-3 scenario, which you will be because it's not an arena. You know, your opponent might side out some of their removal spells against you as, you know, you're a combo deck. So this could be a decent backup plan where they're not going to expect you to play, like, this 1/3 that they have to deal with. So it is actually a pretty powerful thing as long as you've got enough islands in your deck to untap it, the crab, like, 3 or 4 times a turn. But yeah, I wouldn't see this as like a plan A kind of thing, but it is a thing you can include in your deck, and I think it's pretty solid. All right, and our next archetype is classic blue-black control, but with a bit of a madness sub-theme. So our gold uncommon here is Recoil, which doesn't speak to anything particular what blue-black is doing, aside from just being a pretty good card. So this is 1 blue-black for an instant, return target permanent to its owner's hand, then that player discards a card. So solid card in general. The blue-black control shell that, you know, just like a classic blue-black control shell with card draw and removal spells, that's basically what this deck is doing. But there is a bit of, like I mentioned, a madness sub-theme. So once again, madness, for those maybe not familiar, it is a mechanic on creatures and instants and sorceries that says if this card would be discarded, you can instead pay its madness cost. And sometimes the madness cost is more expensive, sometimes it's cheaper, it really varies card to card. But if you have these cards in your deck, you want some sort of discard outlets. So Aquamoeba is a decent one. So 1 in a blue, 1/3. Discard a card. Aquamoeba's power and toughness gets switched until end of turn, which, again, does not sound that good. But, like, if you are attacking for 3 or blocking with a 3-power creature and you're trading, and then you get to, for free, quote-unquote, discard one of your madness cards and get a discount on that, like, that's a pretty good setup. It does not stand out as, wow, this is a great madness enabler, but this is one of the better ones. Zombie Infestation is another one. 1 in a black enchantment. Discard 2 cards. You create 2 black zombie creature tokens. Another thing, you have to be really, really deep into the madness sub-theme for this, where you have to have a lot of madness cards. Otherwise, it's just like massive card disadvantage. But if you are there, it's a playable card. Frantic Search, like I mentioned earlier, the card that draws 2, then discards 2, and it taps 3 lands. Another way that you can enable your madness. And the madness cards, you know, look at what madness cards are in this set. So there aren't a ton. There's not, it's not like a huge theme. But Dark Withering, which is 4 black for an instant at an uncommon, destroy target non-black creature. Pretty expensive, but madness for black, that's a really, really powerful card if you can enable it. Circular Logic, another pretty good one. One of the standard all-stars at the time too. Blue and 2 for an instant at uncommon. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 for each card in your graveyard, and it has madness for a single blue mana. So both of these kind of overcosted cards, but if you can madness them out, they're super, super efficient. Ichor Slick, like I mentioned before, is the -3/-3 removal spell that has cycling and madness. But in general, I think this is just your, like I said, your classic blue-black control deck. You got some counter spells, you got some card draw, some removal. I think generally you're going to be drawn into this deck if you start with a good blue or black rare that wants to go to the late game. For example, Arcanus the Omnipotent, which is a 6 mana, 3/4 that taps to draw 3 cards, and you can pay 4 mana to return to your hand to save it from a removal spell or something. Not a ton of definition here, but I don't think you need a ton of definition when this set is full of good removal, good counter spells and good card draw. All right, next up is red-white auras / enchantress. So, you know, red-white often gets this kind of like equipment / aura theme. I actually don't think there's any equipment in this set. Most of the sets that Dominaria Remastered is made up of did not originally have equipment that just didn't exist at the time. So we're kind of light on that, but mostly you're going to be looking at the auras. The signpost in common is Tiana, Ship's Caretaker. This is the one from Dominaria. 3 white, red for a 3/3 flying first striker. Whenever an aura or equipment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you can return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. I think that this deck is generally just like a red-white aggro deck, and you might have some of the sub-themes in there. Like, I just wouldn't lean into it too hard. There are 2 cards that are quite powerful if you do happen to lean into it. Velduk, Keeper of the Flames, which is a tuna red 3/2 that at the beginning of combat on your turn, for each aura and equipment attached to it, you make a 3/1 trample haste creature. Then you exile those at the end of turn. And Mesa Enchantress, which is 1 white for an 0/2. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you can draw a card. Again, like I mentioned, white is on the slower side, and so I can see you drafting more of a slower white Enchantress deck with Mesa Enchantress and pacifisms and, like, you know, a few other enchantments that are in the set. But in general, like I said, I think this is mostly a red aggro deck with some white cards in there. Some of the good auras that I want to point out, and there aren't a ton of them, but Griffin Guide is one of the best ones, and potentially the actual best one. 2 in a white for a aura. Enchanted creature gets +2 and +2 and has flying, so already pretty good. And when the enchanted creature dies, you make a 2/2 white flying creature token. So pretty efficient. Another one here is Lightning Reflexes, which is 1 in a red for an aura that has a lot of words, but essentially what it boils down to is you can cast this as if it had flash. If you do, you sacrifice it at the end of turn, and the effect of the aura is the enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has first strike. So it's almost like a combat trick, or just an aura that you can play at sorcery speed, and, you know, the buff sticks around. So these are 2 of the better auras if you are into this strategy. Again, I think this is one of the weaker themes, one of the less supported themes. I think that the red aggro cards and the red aggro creatures they don't quite match up to the good blue card draw and the good black removal spells. I think you're going to end up in a spot a lot of the time with this deck that you're trying to play an aggro deck and your opponent's interaction spells are just too efficient. I don't want to sell this as a terrible archetype or anything, because I don't think it is. I would just say, you know, if you're only going to do 1 or 2 Dominaria Remastered drafts, maybe steer away from this one. All right, next up we've got Blue-White Blink. And this is another one kind of like Red-White that I think is not very supported. So the uncommon here, signpost gold uncommon, is Sawtooth Loon. 2 white-blue for a 2/2 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, return a white or blue creature you control to its owner's hand. And when it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards, and then you put 2 cards from your hand on the bottom of your library. So, worth noting, this is not optional. You need to return a blue or white creature. So if this is your only one, you have to return this, and you get some filtering out of the deal. You could keep playing this and draw 2, put 2 in the bottom, but that's not really getting you anywhere. Ideally, what you're doing with this card is you're picking up a Manowar, or just a creature with a good enter the battlefield effect, so you can reuse it. There is Momentary Blink in this set, which is 1 in a white for an instant exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, flashback for 3 in a blue. But aside from this card, there's no actual blink effects in the set. Generally, you're actually just relying on stuff like Sawtooth Loon, stuff like White Mane Lion, which is a very similar card. 1 in a white for a 2/2 flash. When it enters the battlefield, return a creature you control to its owner's hand. So, once again, this is not optional. You need to return a creature, but this is kind of the way you're reusing your enter the battlefield effects. Wormfang Drake is another one. This is 2 in a blue for a 3/4 flyer that when it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless you exile a creature you control other than the Drake. When the Drake leaves the battlefield, you return the exiled creature. So, the idea here is you exile a Manowar or something, and then if they want to kill the Wormfang Drake, you get it back. Again, I think this theme is just, not that supported. There's not that many cards in the set that speak to it. And also, there's not that many good blink targets, at least in white and blue. There are a few good enter the battlefield effects in red and in black, but then you're reaching to another color pair, or another color, and you're going out of color pair, and again, there's not that much fixing. So, I think mostly if you're a white-blue deck, it's going to be a good card deck more than anything else. Some of the things you can blink, Manowar, like I mentioned. Another one that is a card that definitely falls into the category of Is this card good? I'm not sure if this card is good, but it is pretty good. So this is Ascatian Javelineers, a single white mana for a 1/1. It enters the battlefield with a Javelin counter on it, and you can tap it to remove a Javelin counter off it to deal damage to any target. So this snipes off X1s, can finish something off in combat. You can reset this if you blink it or pick it up, but that's kind of what you're working with in white and blue. So yeah, again, not a deck that I think is terrible by any means. You can just have good cards in it, but I just wouldn't lean too far into this theme. All right, the next one is kind of a funny one. So this is red-black Zomblins. So, you know, the classic traditional Magic red creature is goblins, and the classic traditional Magic black creature is zombies. And this archetype basically just melds them together. So the signpost in common that holds all the, you know, the goblins and the zombies together in some weird Frankenstein manner is Drellnu's Crusade, which is 1 black-red for an enchantment at uncommon. All goblins get +1/+1, so it's a 3-mana anthem for your goblins. And it also says all goblins are black and zombies in addition to their other creature types, which is, you know, a little bit strange. Mostly, I think this is a goblin deck more than anything else. There's like 1 or 2 cards that call it zombies. Most of them are calling out goblins, though, and care about goblins. So, what cards are you looking for? Goblin Matron. This is one of the better ones. This is 2 and a red for a 1/1 at common. When it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for a goblin, reveal it, put it into your hand. So, it's a 3-mana 1/1 tutor for a goblin. Mog War Marshal, which is a solid goblin card. 1 and a red for a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield or dies, you make a 1/1 goblin creature token, and it has Echo for 1 and a red, which basically just means when you play this, the next turn you have to pay 1 and a red or else it goes away, which is fine. You actually don't mind sacrificing this because then you make another goblin token. So these are kind of like bread and butter red goblin commons. I think often you're going to be pulled into this deck if you open either Siege Gang Commander or Pashalik Mons, which are 2 really, really good rares that incentivize you to play goblins. They're both pretty good just on their own, regardless of if you have goblins, but they get better when you do play more goblins and have more goblins in your deck. And of course, if you have Goblin Matron, well, you can search them up, which just gives your deck a lot more consistency. Gem Palm Incinerator is another really good one. This is 2 and a red for a 2/1, and it has cycling for 1 and a red. It says, when you cycle the Incinerator, you may have it deal X damage to target creature where X is the number of goblins on the battlefield, which is weird wording because it counts your opponent's stuff too, which a lot of our old cards did that, right? The cycling stuff counts your opponent's stuff, which just very strange. So watch out for that. Some of the wording in the set will trip newer players up. But this is just a good removal spell, right? Just like basically says 2 mana, draw a card, deal damage equal to my goblins, which is just a very efficient removal spell. All right, and to close out our archetypes here, a few straggler archetypes that maybe aren't that supported, maybe aren't that defined, but are definitely worth talking about. So blue-green ramp is one which, you know, I don't think needs a lot of definition. It's just your classic. You got some card draw, you got some big monsters, you got some mana ramp creatures, you know, just a archetype as old as Magic itself. Tatiova, Benthic Druid, which is the one from original Dominaria. 5 mana, 3 green-blue for a 3/3 landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life, draw a card. Really, really strong card. This is like the reason you would want to be blue-green. There's definitely some fatties in there that you can ramp into, but again, not a ton of mechanical definition, but you could end up here, especially if you do take a Tatiova early or see one late. Black-white is another one that I mentioned before. It's, again, on paper, I think it's supposed to be some sort of like, well, my black cheap aggro creatures deal me damage and I gain life back some way to offset that, but that's just like really weird and finicky and doesn't work out the way you want it to enough of the time. I think the better way to play black-white is just like an attrition strategy where, yeah, you've got some removal spells, you've got some card draw, maybe you've got some of the Enchantress stuff in white going on where you're just kind of a grindy deck. Like black-white grind might be a good good descriptor for what I think you want to be doing in this deck. And then the last archetype here, black-green mid-range, or black-green The Rock, as players who are playing in the 90s might know this deck as. So this, the golden common here is actually a banger. This used to be a rare. This was considered one of the best creatures of all time back in the day. But 5 mana for a 6/6. So 3 black-green for a 6/6. Whenever Spiritmonger deals damage to a creature, you put a +1/+1 counter on Spiritmonger. So basically, if you trump it, it gets bigger. Has black, regenerates Spiritmonger, and green, Spiritmonger becomes the color of your choice until end of turn. So a giant creature that regenerates itself, their green ability is really weird. Magic used to do this a lot, where it's like, change the color of something. And it's like, okay, cool. There's a few cards that matters for, but it's weird that they spent so much card text on that ability on so many cards. I think in this set it has like a few relevant interactions where you have Terror, which is a 2-mana removal spell that kills a non-artifact, non-black creature, which of course doesn't actually matter for this card, which is kind of funny as I'm talking about it because it's already black. So I don't actually know if it has relevance in this set. So look out for it. Maybe there's something, but mostly it's just a giant creature that is hard to kill, is basically what you're going after here. And black-green doesn't have a ton of definition. It's just stuff. Black removal spells, green creatures. That's kind of what's going on here. Don't think too hard about it, basically is what I would say. All right, and I just want to close out here with some top cards. Some of the cards that maybe I didn't get around to mentioning in the archetypes. I'm going to go through each color and talk about a few commons and a few uncommons. And yeah, basically, this is just well, when you open your pack, what are the cards you're going to most want to bring to the front of the pack and look at? So starting with white here, I've got Nomad Decoy, which is again that 3-mana 1/2 tapper. Pacifism, classic card, 1 in a white. Aura Enchantment, enchanted creature can't attack or block. And the Javelineers, the Acacian Javelineers that I mentioned. Single white mana for a 1/1, enters the battlefield with a Javelin counter, and you can tap it to remove a Javelin counter to deal 1 damage to any target. So nothing like super standout-y about these white commons, but they are all pretty solid cards that I wouldn't be super happy to first pick them, but you know, taking them early, I don't think you'd be too sad about it. White does have some really awesome uncommons though, so 2 here I want to shout out. Swords to Plowshares, which is just, you know, best or one of the best removal spells of all time. Single white mana, instant, exile target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. Just extremely efficient, deals with anything, and Battle Screech. So I said that white was not particularly aggressive, and this is true, but Battle Screech is such a good aggro card. And it's not even an aggro card, really. Like, it's great in any deck. It's excellent if you're beating down, but really you're happy with this card anytime. So this is 2 white for a sorcery at uncommon. Create 2 1/1 white bird creature tokens with flying. So 4 mana, make 2 birds. Flashback, tap 3 untapped white creatures you control. So you just need to have 1 more white creature, and this is 4 mana, make 4 1/1 flyers, which is just so many flyers. Unless your opponent has a flying blocker, your opponent's gonna have a really, really tough time with this card. And you know, also just like 4 blockers if you need to block with them. Really, really strong card. Yeah, I think, you know, if you can get multiples, they play extremely well in multiples, but you don't need to be anything in particular. You just need a white deck with white creatures in it for this card to be great. All right, next up, blue. Blue's commons, I did get to touching on all of them, but I will just touch on the top 3 here. I think Manowar is my number 1, the 2/2 that bounces something. OG counterspell, blue counterspell, counter target spell, and Deep Analysis. 4 mana, 3 in a blue, sorcery. Target player draws 2 cards, flashback, 1 in a blue, pay 3 life. Just, 4 cards for a singular piece of cardboard. That's just a lot, and especially, this card might look a little slow to folks who are used to Modern Limited, but like I said, these older sets with older cards, you do have a little bit more time to cast a card draw spell. Like, in a normal limited set, if you cast this on turn 4, you're like, wow, I'm really behind. But, in this set, it's like, okay, you cast Deep Analysis on turn 4. What's your opponent going to do? Attack you with their, 1-powered 3-mana creature? Like, it's just, not going to put you as far behind as it would in something like Brothers War. Blue also has 2 really banger uncommons. So, Confiscate. 4 blue for an enchantment aura. Enchant permanent. You control enchanted permanent. Just straight up, you take the thing. So, yeah, just extremely, extremely powerful card. Another classic here, Fact or Fiction. 3 in a blue for an instant. You reveal the top 5 cards of your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. You put one of those cards in your hand, another in the graveyard. So not only is this an excellent card draw spell, but also, fills your graveyard for Threshold if you care about that. Moving on to black, we've got Ichor Slick, which is that Cycling Madness removal spell. Terror, which is 1 in a black for an instant. Destroy target non-artifact, non-black creature. It can't be regenerated, which, does come up, but it kills most of the things you need to kill. And our recent old friend, Phyrexian Rager, 2 in a black, 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose a life. Uncommons here. Only 1 banger uncommon, but it is very, very good. Faceless Butcher, 2 black for a 2/3. When it enters the battlefield, you exile another target creature, and then when it leaves the battlefield, that thing comes back. So usually we see this in whites, stuff like Fiend Hunter or Fairgrounds Warden. Black was the original color that got this effect. One thing I want to call out about this card is there is a trick to this card where The way this is templated, the first ability where it exiles something and the second ability where the thing comes back are separate abilities. So what that means is if you can find a way to sacrifice the Butcher, maybe for free, you've got a Phyrexian Ghoul, you can actually target the thing that you want to exile, sacrifice the Butcher in response, the creature will get exiled, and then the leaves triggers, but that goes in the stack first because the Butcher leaves, and then there won't ever be a point where that thing can come back. It's just gone. So if you want to, you're worried about your opponent having a removal spell or something, you can make this into a permanent removal spell with the right setup. Moving on to red now, I have Chain Lightning as the best common. This is the single red mana sorcery that deals 3, and then I've got 2 goblins here, Goblin Matron and Mog War Marshal. That's the tutoring goblin and the goblin that makes a 1/1 when it dies or enters the battlefield and has Echo. For uncommons, Lightning Rift, like, I went on and on about that card, but I think probably the best uncommon in the set, Flame Tongue Kavu. This is 4 in a red for a 4/2. Enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage to target creature. You often hear creatures that enter the battlefield and kill something referred to as Flame Tongue Kavus or FTKs, and this is the card it came from. Really, really just like, when you compare it to all the other creatures in the set, head and shoulders above basically every other one, aside from rares. This is a splashable card. I would look to splash this, even though there's not a lot of fixing in the set. Busted card. What can I say? If you open one of these, you're very, very happy about it. Not to even mention ways that you can buy this back from the battlefield or the graveyard. And I would look for that, right? If you have a Flametongue Kavu or a Faceless Butcher for that matter, look for ways to buy them back from the graveyard or reuse them with the white creatures that pick things up. So yeah, just a great card in general, but you can even work a little bit more to make it better. And then finally here, we got green. So Werebear is my pick for the top green common. That's the 2-mana mana elf that makes green mana, turns into a 4/4 if you have Threshold. Penumbra Bobcats. This is 2 and a green for a 2/1, and when it dies, you make a 2/1. So, just an efficient little body. Your opponent won't want you to kill this or block it. Pretty annoying. Symbiotic Beast is my last green common here. 4 green for a 4/4, and when it dies, you create 4 1/1 green insect creature tokens. So just like, a lot of power and toughness over the course of multiple bodies. So all these cards are solid. None of them, I think, are as good as some of the other colors commons, to be honest, but, green has historically had trouble in older limited formats, and I think they had a little bit of trouble figuring out some commons that would be up to stuff compared to Counterspell and, Chain Lightning and Mana War and stuff. It does get some pretty good uncommons, though. Deadwood Tree Folk is a 6-mana 3/6 with Vanishing 3, which basically means at the end of 3 turns, this thing dies. You have to sacrifice it. But what it says, when it enters or leaves the battlefield, you return another target creature from your graveyard to your hand. So it's almost like a big Gravedigger that when it leaves, you Gravedig again. Also, a combo with the things that pick up your creatures. So you can keep bouncing this, and it doesn't have to, you don't have to wait the full 3 turns for this to die. You can just keep bouncing this with something, and you can create a bit of an engine if you do have those cards. Call of the Herd, another one that's kind of a old-time constructed banger. 2 and a green for a sorcery that makes a 3/3 elephant token, has flashback for 4 mana. Squirrel's Nest is another pretty interesting one. 1 green for a aura that enchants a land, and the land has tap, create a 1/1 green squirrel token. So, just a solid card. You're pumping out 1/1s as every single turn. Again, I think green is a little bit worse than the rest of the colors, but it does hold its own with these cards. A lot of the other green cards, as I was going through the card file, are kind of fillery. They're like weird combat tricks or weird auras that aren't very good. So yeah, maybe, again, a small piece of advice, if this is your, you're only going to do 1 or 2, maybe steer away from green unless you open a really good bomb rare. All right, and that's all I got to say. So thank you so much for listening and watching. I hope this was helpful for those going to their local game store this weekend to draft this set, or maybe buying a box to draft with their friends. I would recommend it. I think it actually is looking like a pretty cool set, even though it's a little bit different than what you might expect from your normal draft set. But that's cool too. I think different experiences are always welcome, at least in my books. Anyways, thanks for listening, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.